Professor King is a professor at Case Western University. He was a Nuremberg trials prosecutor. He actually walked across from the Nuremberg train station to the Grand Hotel many, many years ago and made some very important decisions very early on in his life. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for his generation and your generation to meet. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Morrison.
I think we're ready to begin. So if you want to make a few introductory remarks, and then as you take questions, I'll pass the microphone to whoever it is that's going to have a question.
Sure. Well, I went to the Yale Law School, and rather than reading dry treatises of law, we looked on the law as a means for social good. So we decided what was socially desirable and not thought up legal reasons to support it. And so I had a sense of mission when I left the law school. And then went to, had a colleague of mine at the Yale Law School who told me about the opportunity for Nuremberg. And that was in the late summer of 1946. And I arrived in Nuremberg as a member of the U.S. prosecution staff in Nuremberg in March 1946. I was the youngest there at 26 on the prosecution staff. We had about 100 lawyers, 2,000 people working on the largest trial in history. One of the aspects of it that was important to me is that I walked to work from the Grand Hotel, which incidentally was a Hitler hotel that Hitler had stayed at. I walked through the ruins of Nuremberg. There was nobody around. People lived in cellars. There was no food or anything. And I developed a greater sense of mission to make sure that what happened in World War II would never happen again. So I worked 100 hours a week at Nuremberg. I prepared the first drafts of 2 or 3 of the opening and closing statements for the United States of America. And I worked on Justice Jackson's closing statement on July 26, 1946, which was a forensic masterpiece, but he didn't use my words. He didn't like ghosts. So I know familiar with the defendants, and I was in the thick of it, so I'd be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'll just proceed along. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to come across to me and fire away.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. So just raise your hand, and then I'll come over and give you the microphone.
Hi, is it on? Okay, I'm curious to know.
I can hear you.
Okay. You were present at the trials, right? I'm curious to know like how they actually ran. Like, do they run like normal trials? And was there like a jury? Like, how did they go about putting these guys on trial?
That's a good question. They selected judges from the 4 powers that ran the trials. The United States had 1 real judge and an alternate. Soviet Union had 1 judge and an alternate. UK had 1 judge and an alternate. France had an alternate. There was no jury trial, as jury trials are not common in Europe. And what Justice Jackson, who ran the whole proceeding, had to do was to combine 5 different legal systems into a workable whole. So it's all judge-made law, and the judges who wrote the law were primarily the American and the UK judges. One was Francis Biddle was the American judge, and Sir Norman Biquet was the UK judge. So it wasn't a jury trial, and it was judge-made. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I have one more really quick. Did you prosecute these guys one at a time, or were they done in groups?
They were done in groups. Here's the deal. We prosecuted the first 23 defendants as a group, but the group wasn't killed as a group. The group was individual groups. So they were prosecuted as individuals, but they were tried together. That basically were leaders of all walks of German life, and each one got a different sentence. For instance, 3 were acquitted, and 11 were sentenced to hang. So it was quite a job that Jackson did. He took great pride in it. He was the chief prosecutor in putting everything together so that it was a workable whole. Any other questions? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Hi. Obviously, the point of a trial is to get a fair hearing from your peers, but because of the atrocities that the Nazis committed during World War II, did you feel that there was more pressure to bring home guilty verdicts on the defendants?
Well, the answer to that is that's a good question. The answer is that 3 defendants were acquitted: Schacht, Van Papen, and Fritzsche. There were several jail sentences, prison terms. Dönitz and Speer and others got prison terms. The Germans convicted themselves with their own documents. In other words, they're the greatest record keepers in history. What we did every day was to read their documents in against them. There was no passion. It was just the judges were very lordly in their demeanor. They were not street corner judges. These were the great legal minds of our time. Chief Justice was Chief Justice of England, and they were used to handling things objectively and dispassionately. On the other hand, some of the evidence, like the movie film on the atrocities in the concentration camp, was a world in itself. It was a German film. It wasn't our film. And so I think it's very important that you keep in mind that as a group of great legal minds operating dispassionately and getting a judgment, which hasn't really been challenged. It's never been challenged. Any others?
Thank you.
What was the toughest choice or decision you had to make during the trials?
I didn't hear you.
What was the toughest choice you had to make, or the toughest decision you had to make during the trials? The toughest choice.
The what?
Toughest choice.
Toughest choice or decision that you had to make.
Oh, yeah. I think it's very important. That's a good question. One of the points there was this, in response to your question. The question, real question was whether you asked for the death penalty. That's a choice. The problem was that these killings and atrocities dwarfed anything that had taken place in the history of mankind. We never had anything like it. And there was a lot of pressure on prosecutors to ask for the death penalty. And I went along with that. But that was one of the choices. I don't know that you could have pulled out and stayed as a member of the prosecution staff and not gone along with it. But the feelings were high. There had been 58.5 million people killed in World War II, and somebody had to be held responsible. And we had the men on the dock who were primarily responsible for those killings. Choices, big choice was whether you use testimony of witnesses or documents. Jackson said that documents would be more important because documents cannot be contravened. Witnesses could be destroyed by bringing up background on them. So he wanted a documentary case, and it worked out well. And that's why the judgment has stood the test of time. Next question. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I have a question about your conversations with Albert Speer. You hear
Yeah,
me? When you were talking with Speer,
yeah.
did you get the feeling that he knew what his actions in the past were wrong, or was he passionate that he believed what he was doing? He believed in it.
Well, Speer was the most ambitious man in the Third Reich. He rocketed to power under Hitler because he was Hitler's choice. And he was the most powerful man in the Third Reich under Hitler. He closed his eyes to the atrocities. I believe he knew what was going on. I never was able to prove anything until after the trial. But there was a conference at Poznan in November 6, 1946, where Himmler had said that he had eliminated almost all the Jewish race from Europe, and that'd be done by the end of the year. Speer was another speaker at the conference. Speer said that he spoke first and left at noon for Hitler's headquarters. Himmler talked around 5 o'clock, and Speer said he wasn't there. But it's impossible for me to believe that Speer didn't know what was going on. He was disillusioned with the Third Reich when he saw Hitler in vengeance against the German people, who he maintained had lost the war, ordering the destruction of Germany. And he contravened Hitler's order for the German destruction of Germany, and then went into the bunker on April 26, 1945, and told him what he'd done. And Hitler said, well, if you were not my architect, I would take the action called for under the circumstance. The answer is he was guilty of closing his eyes to the worst atrocities that had ever been committed. And so he bears a significant burden for that, of guilt for that. That answer your question?
What was your initial reaction in 1951 when many of the life sentences were commuted to shorter terms of imprisonment?
I didn't hear you.
Sorry.
What was your reaction in 51 when many of the sentences were commuted to shorter sentences?
That's a very good question. My feeling was one of revolt, because I worked hard to get a life sentence against the defendant I worked on, Aaron Mills. I thought he was guilty of supreme atrocities. I think freeing all the defendants or relieving them of their obligation to serve their penalties mocked the whole proceeding. But that was done with regard to the defendants that were tried by the U.S. in the subsequent proceedings. It was not done with the people in the first trial, and there was no alleviation of the sentences for the people in the first case. There was on the subsequent proceedings, and I worked on both. Subsequent proceedings, I gave a year of my life to get a life sentence by Welch, and then by a sweep of the pen, then they changed the sentence. The answer is that I was upset. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. How did you deal with the trial emotionally? Were you able to put your emotional feelings aside while you were prosecuting these men?
What's that say?
How did you deal with your own emotions? Were you able to put your emotions aside when dealing with the prosecution of these people?
Well, I was able to deal with my emotions because I was breaking a new course for history, and I was a pioneer. Nobody had ever done it before. And what I was doing is charting my own course. I got very upset with what went on, but that gave me a greater sense of mission. I didn't put my head in the sand. I didn't close my eyes to it. I looked it face on, and I did what had to be done. I worked for the conviction of these people. with passion. I worked 100 hours a week. And I wrote a number of the briefs and closing statements, and I thought that that was my way of working off my feelings, because I knew that trial would be important in history. Nobody had ever done it. It was totally different. It was original ground that we plowed all the while. But I worked off my passions in my work. Thank you.
Thank you.
And next question. Keep these questions.
All right. Looking back on your experience, would you have done anything differently?
Say that.
Looking back on your experiences, would you have done anything differently?
No. I thought that it was very important that you tithe for society. In other words, I was an idealist. And I went over there and gave of myself almost 24 hours, 7 days a week for a year and 3/4. I would not have done anything different. I felt that it was time to come home. I had a child coming along, and I wanted to make the child eligible for presidency of the United States, so it had to be born in the U.S. As it happened, it was a wonderful daughter, but not a boy. I felt that I had worked on the first case, the big case, the international case, the 4-power case. I worked on Jackson's closing statement. I stayed up all night on that. I worked on the brief against the German General Staff and the High Command. I wrote the opening and closing statements for the United States of America versus Erhard Mills. That's pretty heavy stuff at 26 and then 27 years of age. But I was uneasy about feeling back in the States about whether I'd get a job. Now, I was a very good student at Yale Law School, yet the bar for the lawyers of the United States were not in sympathy with Nuremberg, and I had trouble getting a job. So my fears were warranted, but I have no regrets. I would have done exactly the way I did.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You said the bar in the United States was not in sympathy with the Nuremberg trials. Why do you think it was that some of your colleagues in law did not approve of the trials?
Well, in the first place, it was a first. In other words, I said it was ex post facto. In other words, the theory on ex post facto is that the law is changed after the deed is done, and you convict them for somebody for something they didn't know was wrong. The answer to that, incidentally, is that it's a principle of justice, not a limitation on sovereignty. And according to Speer, they all knew what they were doing was wrong. The documents show that the head of the military had legal opinions for what they did, and the legal opinion said what you're doing is wrong, violates the Geneva and Hague Convention. So they knew what they were doing, but the bar didn't bother to read the fine print. And as Jackson said about the common law, it grows by practice. You had to start someplace with international law, some benchmarks to get it going. As international law consisted of writings of professors, exchanges of treaties and all, treatises and all. This was the first. This created the modern framework for international law, breaking new ground for a better world. And most countries in the world have endorsed Nuremberg, except for the United States under the Bush administration, which is totally against what Nuremberg stood for. The UK, Germany in particular, has got the principles of Nuremberg in its constitution, and there are Australia, New Zealand, all most of the countries in the world have endorsed Nuremberg. But the embodiment today of the Nuremberg Principles is the International Criminal Court. And the Bush administration has fought that tooth and nail. They suspended aid to 35 countries because they wouldn't exempt U.S. soldiers from the application of the International Criminal Court. Jackson said at Nuremberg, to pass a poison chalice to our lips, to pass a poison chalice to the lips of these defendants is to pass it to our lips as well. If you're going to have any international law, it's got to apply across the board. I'm hopeful that the U.S. position will be changed sometime in the future because the world has changed and you have 95 countries that are parties to the International Criminal Court, which incorporates the Nuremberg Principle. And I hope that either Bush will change his mind or the subsequent administration will change his mind. But the U.S. is unfortunately not taking a multilateral approach. It's unilateral, doesn't join the law of the sea convention, didn't join the criminal court, didn't join the landman's treaty, and didn't join Kyoto. So I'm hopeful, but that's enough on that one. Any other questions?
After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and Germany was devastated. And many historians believe that this was significant in the breakout of World War II. How do you believe the German people felt about Nuremberg? How did they treat you? And what was your relationship with them?
That's an excellent question. At the time I was at Nuremberg, many people in Nazi Germany and the remnants of Nazi Germany had a guilt complex. They didn't like Nuremberg because they thought it affected them. And many had been party to the crimes that Hitler was committing. But now, the greatest proponent of the Nuremberg Principle, as embodied in the International Criminal Court, is Germany. The Reichstag voted 476 to nothing to endorse the criminal court, which incorporates the Nuremberg Principle. So they've changed. New generation, new feelings. Old generation, guilt. I did go around to German youth groups all over Germany talking about the Nuremberg trials, and they listened, and maybe they were polite, but I don't think the Germans, they felt that they'd been singled out for criminal charges that other people were guilty of too. And they felt that we were tackling them in a new frontier of international law and that had no precedence. So that's their film. It's changed now. Nuremberg is very much part of German history, and it's, as a matter of fact, on the criminal court, Lord Mayor of Nuremberg had written me a letter asking me to do what I could to have the International Criminal Court located at Nuremberg for symbolic reasons. I hope that answers your question.
I also have a second question. In 1945, the United Nations was formed, and that was a year before Nuremberg took place. Did the United Nations have any effect on what happened at Nuremberg, and did you have any relationship with the United Nations, if it did?
Well, they were tied very closely together. The Nuremberg trial was tied very closely together. And so the United Nations in the Charter of 1945, contains a lot of principles on human rights and also provides for the settlement of international disputes primarily by peaceful means. It does give the right of self-defense to countries which need to defend themselves. They're very closely tied in, and the United Nations on December 14th, 1946, endorsed Nuremberg principles. That was very important. And so you do have a very close tie. And the world was coming together. The four nations that had created Nuremberg were also big supporters of the UN. France, UK, USSR, and the USA. At that time, the United States was the leader of the world in drive for peace under the rule of law and not under the rule of force. We don't have that position today because we're fighting rule of law. And I think that it's important that people like you get back there and fight for what we believed in Nuremberg. I don't think the world stands still. I think we need a rule of law in the world. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Next question.
Did you ever feel that certain people who were convicted, they didn't even deserve a trial and that for their atrocities, and that they should have just been killed or sent to jail right away?
The answer is yes. Well, Eichmann escaped us at Nuremberg, and he was seized by the Israelis in Argentina one dark night. And the doctor who did the cloning escaped us. I went to Brazil. The movie Boys of Brazil is a picture of that. And there were some that escaped us by suicide. Himmler, the head of the SS, committed suicide in Hamburg in our custody in late 1945. Robert Ley, the head of the labor movement in Germany under Hitler, committed suicide while in the jail at Nuremberg. Hermann Goering committed suicide just an hour before he's going to be executed at Nuremberg. And so some of them escaped the hangman. The German basically wanted to be shot rather than hung because they felt that there was some stigma attached to being hung. The answer is yes, there were some that escaped us, and I don't think there are any now around now, but it was a feeling that there were a number of people who went to Argentina or Brazil, particularly Brazil, and that they were down there and they needed to be flushed out. But it's hard to do it internationally because of all the rules that apply to bringing people across national borders. The answer is yes. Next question.
Thank you.
You said that when you were at Yale, you heard about the Nuremberg trials and you went, but how were you actually chosen to go? Or did you have to sign up or try out, or how were you chosen?
Well, in the first place, credential-wise, Yale Law School at that time, and it still is the top law school in the world, not just the United States. And you had to be a very good student to go there. I was at top. I did very well there. I wasn't at the top of the class. I did very well. And then I did apply to the War Department in Washington. Colonel Michael-Marcus interviewed me. What happened was that the application didn't move very freely, and I had been with the Milbank Tweed firm, and a man named John McCloy, who was Assistant Secretary of War, just joined the firm when I was ready to go to Nuremberg. And he did give my application a push through a cable to his successor. And next thing I know, I was sailing beyond the Statue of Liberty en route to Nuremberg. And incidentally, everybody in the place got sick except myself and one other on the way over. It was a very rough trip in February, March 1946. So that's how I got there. And I recruited a number of people for Nuremberg after I got there. And some of them were very good, others were less good. The problem was that you had to soar at Nuremberg. You had to look at the new frontier of the world. And some of the lawyers who were great trial lawyers in New York were very good on New York procedure, but they were not so good on the big sweep issues like Nuremberg dealt with. You know, the war issue. How do you treat people during wars? The crimes against humanity issue. Crimes against people for racial, religious, political reasons. These were new issues, and I took to those issues like a duck takes to water, and that's why I did well there. I think that one of the things is, I think Nuremberg was done by very comparative. We had 100 attorneys, but done by comparatively few people who were on the firing line all the while. But I found it fascinating. I never was in a courtroom before I went to Nuremberg, and my first words in the courtroom were, "May it please the court." If somebody had a feather and hit me with a feather, I'd have folded up. But I didn't fold up. Nobody hit me with a feather. But I got my confidence on, and what happened was that I was cross-examining one of the major witnesses for the defendants. And after I got through this extensive cross-examination, then I sat down and thought of all the things I would have, should have asked if I had thought of them. And happily, the defense attorney said, "Well, Mr. King has cross-examined the defense. I want redirect examination on my witness." And so he did redirection. And then I got another shot at cross-examination of this witness. And I got him to make some serious admissions with the treatment of Hungarian Jews who were brought into Germany to build the underground aircraft factories in Germany. So anyway, that's it. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, 1 second.
Hi. Do you think that more people involved?
Quiet.
Okay. Do you think that more people involved in the Holocaust should have been tried at the Nuremberg trials?
That's a good question. The problem was that we didn't know the total extent of the Holocaust at the Nuremberg trials. However, we tried Kaltenbrunner, who was the head of the Gestapo at Nuremberg. We tried individual military defendants for what they did to contribute to the Holocaust. The answer is that the Holocaust was so massive that they hadn't discovered all the evidence at Nuremberg by the time Nuremberg happened. And that was a limitation, but it didn't limit us on the number of defendants. Leaders of the Gestapo, the leader of the Gestapo was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and we put him on the dock at Nuremberg, like we did one from every other walk of German life. Kaltenbrunner was head of the police union. We had a couple of generals. We had the admiral who was head of the Navy, a couple of admirals head of the Navy. We had industrialists. We had civil servants. The answer is there probably wouldn't have been any more defendants at the big trial at Nuremberg. It might have been later on in the subsequent proceeding. That answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Fine.
Hi again. I know this is a pretty vague and general question, but I was wondering if you believe that justice was served out at the Nuremberg trials overall.
Well, I think that it was even-handed justice. They were very fair. The Soviet Union wanted to convict everybody, and the French and the Americans and the English wouldn't allow it. The Soviet Union took a position that there's a presumption of guilt, not innocence, and so they said everybody was guilty. The Americans took the view with the British, and they were the group that controlled everything. They took the view that it should be fair, it should be even-handed, and the decision is very analytical. I think it was very fair. After all, it had some acquitted, some given jail sentences, prison terms, others who were executed. It couldn't have been fairer because the Germans convicted themselves from their own documents. This is not where we relied too heavily on witnesses. We had 28 witnesses, but they played a small role in it. Conviction based on document, justice done. That's it.
Thank you.
Didn't the Germans destroy some of their documents? Like, was it hard to convict people if some of the documents weren't there because they were destroyed?
Well, give you an example. We had 465 tons of foreign ministry documents, which we covered in a salt mine. They weren't able to destroy the documents. I don't know why. See, one of the problems on these documents was that they thought they were going to win. They came within a whisker of winning the war. And so everybody wanted to ingratiate themselves with Hitler. And so they wrote documents that were wonderful for our purposes. But basically, I don't find that we lack documents on anything. If I had a meeting with Heinrich Himmler at 12:15 on January 2nd, 1942, and this is highly hypothetical, at 12:15, he'd tend, after we finished at 12:30, take 20 minutes to write up a synopsis meeting. So that's how we convicted him, was documents. That makes war crimes trials since then very hard.
We only have about 4 minutes left, so I want to take the time to ask a question. One thing that we talked about was, were the Allies really the good guys in World War II? And in your book, you have a picture of Nuremberg bombed out by the Allies. Did you find it problematic to try the Germans for war crimes when the Allies had bombed German cities?
Well, the Allied crimes were that they were alleged. The defendants alleged this. The Allied crimes were allegedly destruction of Dresden and other cities, but international law at the time of Nuremberg was not adopted to air warfare. It had no. I wanted to charge my defendant with the bombing of Rotterdam after the white flag went up, and they said no. We're not engaged in charges about air warfare because there's no basis in international law. So I think that the Germans have made that argument ever since. But the fact was we were right on that there wasn't any rules governing air warfare at that time. Subsequently, there have been. But that's my answer. I'm not sure that satisfies the Germans because of the demonstrations yesterday or 2 days ago in Dresden where they were demonstrating against the Allied bombing raids. But international law is being adapted to weapons of war, and it's more available now than it was then.
We only have a couple minutes left. Is there anything that you would like to share with students? You know, someone who's lived a full life to students.
So I'll close by saying that I hope someday you'll have a sense of mission to make the world a better place for future generations. I think it's important that we live for posterity, not that we live for the future. And it's important that we create a better world for people who arrive on the planet at some subsequent time. And I think that it's most important that all of you, if possible, tie the bit for humanity. It'll make for a much better world. And that's the sense of mission I had at Nuremberg. And we have, to our credit, an international context to operate today. We have the concept of international human rights, which really emanated from Nuremberg. Also, we have better development of the rules governing the warfare. We have a criminal court which exists incorporating the Nuremberg principles. We have 2 proceedings go on in Hague and Rwanda for Nuremberg-type crimes. I think in the long run that we'll have a better world. One of the problems you have is that the world's becoming so mechanized that you have to assert the human spirit. You have to assert your individuality, become an individual, strike out for some of the things that are worthwhile in life, and like human rights and other things. So I leave that thought with you. I hope you have a sense of mission, as I did. I hope that you get a sense of fulfillment. After all, I'm at the twilight of my existence, but what do I think is the most important thing I did was Nuremberg. And I've left my footprints. So I hope you'll leave some footprints, and I want to thank you very much for your interest. It's much appreciated. And I'm happy to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we'll talk to you later on today.
Yep.